is today's daf is Mem Tet, number 49. We are at the top of the Amud, 4 lines from the top. Bizman Shein Lachin. So we go back to the Mishnah that distinguished between certain kinds of materials that could not be used for insulation at all, and certain types of materials that could not be used for insulation when they are wet or moist, but when they're dry, they can be used. And to be specific, the thing, what can be used when it's dry but not when it's wet, was teven, straw, zagin, that's grape skin, velo b'mochin, and that was the fabric, velo ba'asavin, and grass. So these things can be used when they are dry but not when they are wet. So now the Gemara asks the following question. They ask the question. When it says when they are wet, you can't use them, but when they're dry, you can. So what kind of wetness are we talking about? Are we talking about the natural moisture of the entity, or are we talking about when you wet it? Okay, in other words, is it saying you can't pour water on it and use it, or is it saying if it's naturally still moist, that's the problem? But pouring water on it wouldn't make it a super insulator. So the Gemara says, Tashma, come and listen. Lo b'teven v'lo b'zagim v'lo b'mochin v'lo b'asavim b'zman shein lachin. That you can't use straw, you can't use grape skin, you can't use the fabrics, and you can't use asavim, you can't use grass when they're wet. If you're talking about wet from any source, in other words, it doesn't matter what the source of the moisture is, it's still going to be prohibited, that makes sense. But if you're telling me that the only moisture that's problematic is a moisture that comes from the thing itself, the natural moisture, what kind of natural moisture does the fabric have? What kind of natural moisture does it have? Answer, the Gemara answers, Mimarta de bene atme. That if you take wool or you take fabric that was between in certain from certain parts of the body, okay, like the legs, like the inner leg of the animal, it will be wet from sweat. So it's actually naturally moist. Maybe that's what it's talking about when it says wet. Naturally moist fabric. What about that which Rabbi Oshaya said? He said you can use a blanket or a kesut can either mean a blanket or it can mean any kind of garment. Okay, a garment that is dry or fruit that's dry. But you can't use clothing that is wet or fruit that's wet. So the Gemara says again, wait a second. So where are you going to find a case where clothing is wet of its own accord? Do you ever open up your closet and you see your clothes are wet? Only if you didn't dry them.
Or right? There is a roof leak.
Yeah, the roof leak's in there. Right.
My scuba diving equipment.
Yeah. So what do you see? That's not from itself though. So the answer is again, it says, if you were to make clothing out of certain kinds of fabric that is naturally moist because it comes from a part of the animal's body that's naturally moist, that's where you would have that's where you would find naturally occurring moisture. But the point is we cannot conclude one way or the other whether extraneously added moisture is also problematic or only natural moisture is problematic. Now the Mishnah says, you can use kesut, you can use, in other words, clothing or a blanket or whatever, and you can use fruit. You can use the wings of a dove. That would be interesting. You can use sawdust. And when you would comb flax, you would get this byproduct. You would get this these sort of chips that would come out of it. So the fine chips you can use for insulation because they're fine. They won't. So Rabbi Yehuda oser badaka matir bagasa. Rabbi Yehuda says the fine chips are too good at insulating. You can't use them. Okay, the larger ones, the bulkier ones, because obviously when you use something bulkier, it's less able to really to stick close to the pot. Okay, because the big chips, they can't really adhere to the pot, so they're not going to insulate as well. Sand insulates really well because you can pack it in. You can really pack it in.
It's interesting that, they were really aware of
the heat, the properties. It is really interesting.
Compositions of.
You know why we're disconnected from it? It's because we don't live in a natural world anymore.
Right, so they observed it.
We buy everything from the store. We buy everything pre-made. An insulator? I'll buy it in a package. We don't go into the forest and experiment with what works.
Today it's just done in the lab.
Well, how come it gives moisture in fruit? How come, so it's not just moisture, it's just moisture.
What do you mean? What was the question?
What you can't use. You can't use that cloth, right?
Right.
But you can use fruit.
Right, you can use fruit to insulate.
But fruit...
But apparently if it's moisture, if it's dry, I guess dry produce, you could put against the pot to try to hold the heat.
But you can't...
And again, this is always talking about Erev Shabbat. This is not talking about on Shabbat.
Right. So
but you can't use wet produce because I guess the water will...
on the outside.
Right, the wetness will...
moisture inside it.
Right, of course, everything does. Everything does. Right. Then you wouldn't be able to hold the pot because you have a lot of moisture inside.
Okay.
Yeah. Right, so it's only on the surface. Okay, so now, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yanai says, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Mishnah, just FYI, but since the Mishnah mentioned Kanfei Yonah, wings of a dove, we're going to learn the famous story about Elisha Bal Kanafayim. Okay? So, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yanai says, Tefillin tzrichin guf naki, ke Elisha Bal Kanafayim. That tefillin require a clean body, like Elisha Bal Kanafayim. Elisha who had wings. Now, you might say, wow, he could fly, he had wings. What are we talking about here? We'll see in a second. But the point is you have to have a clean body. Maihi, what does it mean, a clean body? Abaye says that you have to be careful enough with yourself that you don't pass gas when you're wearing tefillin. That's what it means to have a clean body. That you regulate yourself, that you know when you need to go to the bathroom and you won't disrespect the tefillin like that. Rava says that you shouldn't sleep in them. In other words, you have to be vigilant enough that you won't fall asleep wearing the tefillin. The point here is that a person needs to have a heightened sense of their own body with regard to sleeping, because if you fall asleep, you don't know what your body's going to do when you're asleep with the tefillin on. And Abaye says, even when you're awake, you need to be vigilant and make sure that you don't have gas when you're wearing tefillin. So, why did they call Elisha Bal Kanafayim? Because once the Romans made a decree against the Jews that anybody who wore tefillin, they would puncture his brain. In other words, they would kill him. So, Vaya Elisha Benicham. And Elisha didn't care. He knew that they would kill him, but he went wearing tefillin anyway. So a certain official saw him, so he ran away. So the official chased him. And as the official was catching up with him, he took the tefillin off and he had it in his hand. Amarlo, he said to him, what's in your hand? Amarlo, kanfei yonah. All I have is the wings of doves. He said, really? And obviously he was telling us a fib. When he opened his hand, that's what was in them. Okay? So a miracle happened. Exactly. He switched one with the other. A miracle happened. And now this could mean a miracle literally. It could also mean that... sometimes like some of the Mefarshim say that when miracle stories happen in the Talmud, they can be expressed in it can be the expression of a naturalistic kind of miracle, but using hyperbole to express it. So, for example, one could interpret this to mean that he opened his hands and the guard really thought he saw the wings of doves in the hands of the rabbi. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was transubstantiation or something like that, and the tefillin became a new thing. And anyway, what would he do then? He has no tefillin. You have to turn it back now. We're going to see what that represents in a second. Yeah. So that's why people wrap their tefillin on the two sides, because of the wings of the dove, to remember the story. That's the basis for it. So Lefichach Korinoto Elisha Bal Kanafayim. That's why they called him the one that had wings. It didn't mean his body had wings. It means his hands had wings in them. Why did he mention a dove's wings? This is your question. Because the Jewish people are compared to a dove. Because it says, like the wings of a dove overlaid with silver. And this is a reference to the Jewish people. Ma yonah, knafeh meginot aleha, af Yisrael mitzvot meginot alehen. Just like the yonah, its wings protect its body, so too, the Jewish people, their mitzvot protect them. So that's why the first bird he thought of was the yonah, the dove.
Also loyal.
Yeah, that's true. Nasor shel charashim. You can use sawdust to insulate from before Shabbat. They asked a question. Rabbi Yehuda, Nasor shel charashin ka'eh, or aneorat shel pishtan ka'eh. Because in our Mishnah there are two things mentioned. One is sawdust, and one is what you comb out of the flax. Okay? So both of these things can either be coarse or big pieces, or they can be very fine. And then Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, you can't use the fine, you can only use the coarse. So which one was he talking about? Sawdust and what you comb out of flax, or just the flax? So the Gemara says, Tashmakam, listen to Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says in a Baraita, Ne'oret shel pishtan daka harihi kazevel. Shemamina, Ne'oret shel pishtan ka'eh, Shemamina. We see that in the Baraita, Rabbi Yehuda only mentions what you comb out of the flax. He says if what you comb out of the flax is very fine, it's the same as using manure, which is very is a high power insulator that you're not allowed to use. So he was only talking about what you comb out of flax. There, you're not allowed to use the fine. You're only allowed to use the coarser material. But sawdust, apparently everybody agrees you can use even the fine sawdust. Now the next Mishnah says, you can use animal hides to insulate, and you can handle them on Shabbat too. You can use the shearings of the sheep, in other words the wool, but you cannot handle them. Now this is different than what we said before. Mochin are already kind of made into fabric, when we talked about mochin before, we're talking about pieces of fabric that are already ready to be worked with. Now we're talking about just the raw wool that was just sheared off the sheep and it's just there. So the question is, you can use it, but you can't handle it because it's muktzeh. So ketzad, what do you do? Ketzad hoseh notelet kisui ve'noflot. You can cover the pot with the wool, and then the top of the pot is sticking out. You take the top of the pot, you pull it out, and everything falls. It's okay. You're not directly handling it. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Kupa mate al tzida. Tilt the box on the side, v'notel, and take it that way. In other words, he doesn't want you to lift the pot out. What the rabbis are saying is you can lift it directly out of from the top of the pot. You can pull it out. He says, don't do that. Tilt the box, because remember we said that the way they insulated was they had a box. Right. The box would be filled with the wool, and the pot is put inside, and then the wool is put on top of the pot too.
But isn't that going to spill all over the?
What? Oh, if you do, it's a good question.
Well, maybe you're taking an insert out.
Maybe I don't know how I can't. It's hard to envision, but I guess you have to be. Maybe it wasn't so liquidy. I don't know. But he'd lean it and take it that way. Why? Because the problem is if you take the whole pot out on Shabbat, now the wool is going to fall back in, and you can't put it back in now because you can't move the wool, so you won't be able to put the pot back into the insulation. And you might want to do that, just like you want to put the pot back on the fire, over the blech on Shabbat. So he says, the Chachamim say we're not worried about that. You can take it out, and you can you can assume that probably the wool is going to stay in place. We'll see. The Gemara is going to explain what the exact machloket is later. Now the Gemara says, Yativ Rabbi Yonatan ben Achinai, Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar, Yativ Rabbi Chanina bar Chama Gabai. 3 rabbis were sitting together. Rabbi Yonatan ben Achinai, Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina bar Chama. They asked the following question: Shalachin Shabbat Labay Tenan, Abal Shelaban Kevin the Kapita Layolo Metatalinan, Leho Odilma Shel Umantinan, Kol Shekin Shel Balabay. The question is like this: we said that you can insulate with skins on Shabbat, before Shabbat rather. You can use animal skins, and you can handle them on Shabbat. You're allowed to handle the skins. The question is, what kind of skins are we talking about? Are we talking about the skins of a person, a private homeowner, has animal hides around, so he can handle them because he can use them for whatever he wants? Or are we talking, what about professional ones? What about if you are a hide seller, and you happen to have in your house some hides? Can you handle those on Shabbat? Because the problem is they're merchandise. You're not going to want them to get ruined. Because if you ruin them, you won't be able to sell them. So Amar Lahu Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar said, Miztab Rashul Bal Bayit Tanan, we're only talking about a private homeowner's hides. Aval shel uman kapitalayu. But a professional who sells these, he's not going to want to use them on Shabbat. You can't. In other words, they're what's called muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis. They are muktzeh because you don't want to lose money, and since you don't want your merchandise handled on Shabbat because you want to sell it after Shabbat. You don't want it to get damaged, so you're not going to want to use it on Shabbat. So therefore, it's out of your mind on Shabbat. Any merchandise is out of your mind. Rabbi Chanina bar Chama said, Kachama Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosef said the following: Abba shalachahava. My father was a professional seller of animal hides. Va'amar, and he used to say, Haviu shalachin v'neshav aleihem. Bring the hides, let's sit on them, because sitting on them didn't damage them. So, therefore, I know from personal experience, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosef was saying, he knew from personal experience that even a merchant would use them casually for certain uses. And if they could be used for sitting on, then they're not muktzeh.
Probably made them better, softer.
Maybe it even softened them up a little more. There is an objection. It says that when it comes to boards, pieces of wood, if you're a private individual, and those are just pieces of wood lying around in the house, you could use them to sit on, or whatever they would use them for, or to put food on. However, if you're a professional and you sell wood, you don't want to spill food on it, you don't want it to break, you don't want it to get bent, so you're not going to be able to use it on Shabbat. But if you thought from before Shabbat, I'm going to use this to serve food, then it's okay. Otherwise, stam, if you didn't have any specific intention, we assume that the regular balabayit doesn't care that much about what happens to his wood. So you sit on it, whatever, it gets bent, whatever. But the merchant is stam, whatever's for sale is out of his mind. On Shabbat, he's intending not to use it, he doesn't want it to be used, he wants to preserve it so he can get the best price. So the Gemara says, so shouldn't we also say by hides the same thing? Right? So the Gemara says, no, Shani Nisarim, the Kapitalayu, Nisarim are different. Boards are different because they can get bent, they can get warped. The hides are not going to get warped. Like you said, at worst, maybe it'll get a little softer. Maybe it'll be better for it. Tashma, come again and listen. Orot ben abudin ben she'en abudin mutal letaltalan b'Shabbat. Lo amiru abudin ela le'inyan tuma bilvad. Hides, in order to handle them on Shabbat, it doesn't matter if they've been fully tanned, fully processed or not. We only say that a hide is not complete until it's processed with regard to tum'ah. In the laws of tum'ah, something will not be mekabel tum'ah, will not be receptive to tum'ah until the kli, the vessel, is finished. And so, for hides, that means they have to be completely me'ubad. It has to be completely tanned and processed. Okay? When it comes to Shabbat, though, anything that has utility is good. We don't say it has to be a tanned hide, it has to be a fully processed hide to be used on Shabbat. But what do you see here? What distinction is made here? Only between tanned and not tanned. My love, lo shena shel balabayit v'lo shena shel uman. Doesn't this imply that it doesn't matter whether it's owned by a private individual or a merchant? Because if we're sitting and making distinctions between types of hides that you're allowed to handle and that you're not allowed to handle on Shabbat, and it's already told us that we're allowed to handle unprocessed hides, shouldn't it also mention that we're not allowed to handle hides of a merchant, if that's true? So this seems to prove that we don't make that distinction, because it's not mentioned. The Gemara says, no, lo shel balabayit shel uman, mai, en metaltalin. No, I could still argue that a merchant's hides you cannot handle on Shabbat. But if that's true, why doesn't this Braita say it explicitly? Why doesn't it come along and say, and when did we say you can handle any hide, whether processed or unprocessed, only for a Baal Habayit, not for a professional, not for a merchant? Why does it mention that? if it's true that it's prohibited? Answer, Kula bebala bayit kamayri. The answer is that since the topic was privately owned hides, the Braita doesn't have to bring in every distinction. If it's on a topic already, it needs to make all the relevant distinctions. But bringing in the issue of a merchant's hides when we're not talking about merchants would be extraneous. So the fact that it doesn't mention it doesn't prove anything. Now we finally say, Katanae. Actually, this is a machloket Tanaim in the end. Orot shel balabait metaltelinotan v'shel uman in metaltelinotan. The Tanna Kama says that skins of a balabait, of a regular homeowner, you can use on Shabbat, you can move them around, but not of a merchant. Rabbi Yossi Omer, echad ze v'echad ze metaltelinotan. According to Rabbi Yossi, either one is good for being able to move it around on Shabbat. So actually, this whole discussion is really a machloket Tanaim.
So how do they know about the machloket Tanaim if it's not said in the Mishnah?
What?
How do they know that? I mean,
this is a Braita. So in the Braita.
Oh, so they bring
it's a Braita. Yeah, it's a Braita.
Okay, right.
Now the Tosafot mentions that from the fact that we said earlier that it seems that Lema'aseh, practically they followed the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and they allowed people to move these hides on Shabbat. That's what Tosafot says on the top of the Amud. Now we get into a very interesting discussion, somewhat tangential but general, that this same group of three rabbis, the two Rabbi Yonatans and the Rabbi Chanina that we saw at the beginning of this discussion, are still having a conversation, and they bring up another topic. They ask the following question: the number 39 melachot prohibited on Shabbat, where does it come from? What does it correspond to? Rabbi Chanina bar Chama said it's because there are 39 distinct labors in the Mishkan. Amar lehu Rabbi Yonatan Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yonatan Rabbi Elazar said, no. Kach Amar Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosei said, Ben Lekunya. So this was 3 generations, okay? Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosei Ben Lekunya said, Keneged melacha melachto umlechet shebatorah arba'im chaser achat. If you count every place in the entire Torah that it says the word melacha, melachto, or melechet, it's 39. That's where they got it from. By Rav Yosef said, Vayavo abayta lasot melachto mimenyanahu olo. Now there's a very interesting issue. Actually, it turns out that there are 40 examples. There are 40. So one of the two we have to disqualify.
That's what they say, Abraham Chaser Echad.
Right. So there are only 39 counts. So one of them doesn't count. So which one is it? So there are 2 possibilities the Gemara is going to try to deal with here. One is that it says with Yosef, the day that he came home and Potiphar's wife finally tried to pounce on him, was, it says, Vayavo habayta la'asot melachto. He came home to do his melacha. So there are 2 interpretations of it. One is that it's literal. He came home to do his work and there was nobody there, so she tried to take advantage of it. However, there's another interpretation, that Lasot Melachto is a euphemism, and it means he actually came home and finally said, you know what, I'm going to give in to Potiphar's wife. But then he saw the vision of his father's face telling him, don't do it. And that's why he didn't do it. So if we interpret Lasot Melachto with Yosef as a euphemism, it wouldn't count. Okay, so that's what he says. He says, do we count that? So Amar le Abai said, "Velete sefer Torah v'limne." Bring a sefer Torah and let's count. Milo Amar Rabba Bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan lo zazu mishamat sheviu sefer Torah u'menaum. Wasn't there a case in which Rabba Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said that they once had a disagreement about counting the words up in the Torah, and they said, "Bring a sefer Torah, let's count it." So why don't we count it? Amar le ki kamisafkali mishum dichtiv amlacha itadayam miminyanahu. So he says, it's not that I don't know how many times the word melacha is written in the Torah. I know, it's 40 times. My only question is, which of these 2 is going to be excluded? There are 2 possibilities. One is that Yosef story, word melachto, would be excluded. The other possibility is, at the end of the Melechet HaMishkan, when it describes the bringing of all of the materials for the Mishkan, it says, V'hamelacha hayitad dayam. The melacha was enough. So does that count? And as Rashi says, in other words, if we count that one, so then we have to not count Yosef. If we count Yosef, we have to not count that one. We'll see why we wouldn't count that one in a second. Okay, so and if we count the one at the end of the description of the Mishkan, which is in Parashat Ki Tisa, I believe. Oh no, it can't be. It must be in Vayakel. So that one, in that case, it's in Vayakel. That pasuk where it says "V'hamalacha haytad dayam," the malacha was enough. If we count that as number 39, we can't count the one about Yosef. We'll say the one about Yosef is a euphemism. It really means he was coming home to do a different kind of work, not the kind he was supposed to. All right? Or maybe we'll say that no, Yosef was really coming home to do work. It was innocent.
Assuming it's the first interpretation, do they know what melacha they're talking about?
What do you mean?
What melacha did he come to do?
Whatever melacha he did in the house.
He was the head of the
He was the head of the household. Whatever.
How would you use that as a base? As a basis?
It's not implying that means that there's that it correlates with the Hilchot Shabbat.
No, but
just that there were 39.
No, but they're taking out one of the melachot based on that.
It was just a word.
They're not taking out a melacha. The question is, we need to get to 39, and we have 40 mentions of the word melacha. And the drasha is saying that there should only be 39. Yeah, that's it. So so if you're going to include Yosef, then the thing in Parashat Vayakel, where it says the melacha was enough, that's what it means, the shalim le'avita, that they were done with all they had to do. It doesn't mean melacha. It's just a way of saying whatever their responsibility was, and which in this case was the bringing of the contributions, was done. It doesn't actually mean melacha. So one of the two is being used in a more general term, either as a euphemism or it's being used in the sense of they completed their task. It doesn't actually mean malacha. It doesn't actually mean craft.
Either way, if they prove that is true, they're going to have to actually come up with one melacha that's either added or subtracted.
Well, no, because we know the number is 39.
No, but if they do prove here, let's say, oh, okay, that's great. Which miracle?
Okay, that we're going to get to. We'll get that to a second. That's a separate question.
We're not
talking about which ones.
Tasks of doing. We're just
talking about the numbers.
No, I understand that.
Given all the trouble with this
right.
way of justifying 39, how come this doesn't get thrown out?
Yeah, well, in the end they say teku. We're not really sure how to resolve it, and it says like this. That Tanya Kemanda Amar Keneged Avodot Mishkan. That really there's more of a support. There's a support in the Braita for the other version. Why? Because the Tanya says in the Braita, En Chayavina Ela Amalacha Shekiyot B'Haita B'Mishkan. Because it says you're only liable for violating Shabbat if what you did was like what they did in the Mishkan.
Because again, if you take this interpretation and it's okay 39 malachat, then
I'm going to get to that. No, I'm going to get to that. Okay.
Right.
So hold on. Hem zar'u ve'atem lo tizra'u. They sowed seeds for the Mishkan. Why? Because they had to grow plants to get dye from it for the coloring of the various fabrics. Hem katzru ve'atem al tiktzeru. They reaped because they had to reap those plants. You shouldn't reap. They would take boards from the ground and put them in the wagon. Therefore, you can't transfer something from a public to a private domain. They would move things from the agala, from the wagon, which was a covered wagon, so it was a private domain, to the public domain, to the ground. So therefore, you shouldn't move from a private to a public domain. They would pass things across the public domain from one wagon to another. So therefore, you should not pass from a private domain to a private domain. The Gemara says, what's the problem with passing from a private to a private? Answer, either Abaye and Rava said this together, or it was Rav Adabar Ava, you can't pass from a private domain to a private domain when there's a public domain in the middle. Okay? And that's what we learned from. So it would seem that there's a good support for the idea that we learn melachot from the melachot of Shabbat from Masekhet Mishkan. Okay, Tosafot raises a question here on the bottom. Okay, so he says lichora, the second to last Tosafot, where it says keneged, or third to last. This answers your question. So the question that Matthias asks is a good question, which is according to the opinion that says that all we have are 39 mentions of the word melacha. So how do you know what the melachot are?
Right.
So he answers here. He says, everybody agrees that what the malachot are has to be learned from the Mishkan. Okay, Parashat Shabbat, the Parashat Mishkan. Because we know the semichut, that the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat is juxtaposed to the building of the Mishkan, to tell you that what you do in building the Mishkan, you can't do on Shabbat. Okay, ve'od, and furthermore, de'i lo yalef mi Mishkan. Here is Matthias's question, because of his French background, he had the mind of Tosafot. They said, if you didn't learn from Mishkan, im ken echi yad'inan lididei haynin hu avot melachot v'hay toladot. How are you going to know what the avot melachot are? What are the toladot? What are the subsidiary melachot? How are you going to know? You couldn't say, this is we're reading from Tosafot here, you couldn't say that they just made it up from their mind. Oh, we think this is an important one. We're going to call this Av Melacha. We're going to call this number 3. This will be number 4. It was just from their own mind. Ve'od, and furthermore, because it says in the Mishnah a few parakim from now in Parak HaZorek, Hamoshit Chayav, that if you pass from the Reshut HaYachid to the Reshut HaYachid through the Reshut HaRabim, he says Chayav, you're Chayav Shekach Hayta Avodat HaLevi'im, because this was the way the Levi'im worked. Okay, I'm sorry, it's not to a Reshut Yachid, it's from a Reshut Yachid to a Reshut Rabim. Even though you didn't pass it, you passed it from one person to the other, it's still the Melachav Moshit. Because that's how they did it. The Avodat Alvim. Now he gives the answer. So therefore, what do you need the 39? In other words, if we have the Melachot from the Mishkan anyway, so what do you need this number 39? So he answers that what this position is saying is not that we don't, there's so much proof that we learn it from the Mishkan. He's not discarding that. He's adding something. What is he adding? That there are so many melachot. There are so many similar melachot. And we count them both as avot. Why? Kigon miraked uborer. For example, sifting flour and borer are the same thing. What's the difference? Sifting miraked is just sifting the bad out of the good from flour. Borer is taking the bad out of the good. What's the difference? The same. Lekach chilkum chachamim lehashlim minyan melachot shebatorah ho'el v'chalukot kitzad zo mizo. In other words, what he's saying is that if we only had the Mishkan and we didn't have the 39 mentions of the word melacha, how would we? Then what would happen is that melachot like that would be one. There would be one. We don't need the number 39. In other words, very nice that you learn it from the Mishkan, but how do you know the number 39? Since we could consolidate and say that these are really two versions of the same. So therefore, they're together. And that's why he goes on to say, V'iyafshad lo marken, de lo palig midika amar besamuch, Tanya keman damar keneged avodot ha-Mishkan, mashmad de palige. But he says, however, in the end, we can't really say this. Why? Because it sounds like it's a machloket. Because what does the Gemara do? It brings the Braita that tells you to support the view. In other words, to support the view that we learned it from the Mishkan, it brings the Braita that says they learned it from the Mishkan, implying that the guy who learned it from how many times it mentions Melacha doesn't learn it from the Mishkan. Okay, so we have trouble here. So he says, "Mashma de pligei ve'od leman de ledrashat de melechet umlacha minalei de chashiv zoreu borer b'shtayim." And moreover, in other words, you're basically saying that they need each other, because the opinion that says you learn it from the Mishkan, how does he know 39? He's going to need the other guy's drasha. The guy who says the drasha of the 39, how does he know which one of the 39? Right. He needs the Mishkan. So you're basically saying they have a codependency here.
That's why they didn't throw
right? So what kind of machloket is it where you need both? He says it sounds like it's supposed to be a machloket, not that they're complementary. Right? So what does he say? Ve'od, and moreover, lekaman mashma de mita'am de keneged avodot ha-Mishkan gereda itlal achshuvenu betarte. De kamar bev rabba per klal gadol kol milta d'havai ba-Mishkan af agav de kedadam yalach hashivla. So basically, in the end, he says he doesn't give an answer. In other words, he basically says that it would seem that everybody needs to learn from the Mishkan, but then you run into a problem, which is if everybody learns from the Mishkan, then you're saying that there's no real argument here. There's two complementary views. One view that's providing the target number, and one view that's providing the source. So that sounds very nice, but Tosafot is but. is bothered by two problems. Number one, that it sounds like it's being presented as a real machloket, not as two complementary drashot. And number two, that it would seem that from other sources, that in and of itself, based on Mishkan alone, we would come up with the number 39. Later on in the Masechet. So he doesn't really resolve the problem of how does the person who learns it from Melechet, Melachto, Melacha derive which Melachot are which. But he raises the problem and he gives you one way that it could be resolved. Have a great day.